Mecca. Okay, all these things are fairly obvious, and most Muslims in the United States, in Europe, worldwide, observe these 5 pillars really with very, very little conflict with other non-Christian or non-Muslims living next to them. But the duties to family and society, okay, are much more comprehensive. In fact, in many ways, they are very similar to a Jewish law, if you're familiar with Jewish law. Jewish law, probably the thing that most people are familiar with are kosher laws. Okay? And Islam has something similar to kosher laws called halal. It's not as extensive, but for example, animals need to be slaughtered in a certain way, and there are certain things that need to be kept clean. Okay? What this requires from a Muslim perspective, and has historically always required, is that the general population lives according to certain ideas of justice, and that society supports a particular vision of the individual and of the family. Okay, in general, what that means, for example, is that everyone has a right to marriage. It's the obligation of parents to make sure that their children are married. Children, centuries before Western countries had laws that protected children, Islamic law has an entire section that protect the rights of children for education, for particular levels of sustenance. For instance, a child has a right to breastfeed for a certain amount of time according to Islamic law. There is no such thing as alimony and child support. It's dictated by Islamic law. That essentially, we often think of divorce as being easy in Islamic law, but essentially, what it means is that you can separate. Your obligations don't end. There is no divorce court or anything like that. You can separate, but you are obligated to pay a certain amount of your money to support your family. Okay? There are lots and lots of restrictions on inheritance, on selling property, on worship, on things that can conflict with worship. Okay, all of these things that are regulated, with the idea that it creates a society in which it is easy to fulfill the law. Okay? The assumption behind it also is that human beings, and this is something that comes very much in conflict with our ideas of modern democracy and secular society, that human beings do not have the rational capability to come up with laws that are just. Okay? That left to our own devices, that if we all vote, that we won't necessarily, in fact we probably won't, come up with laws that are just. There is a great skepticism in Islam of whether of human reason, that human beings really can't know what's good for them. Right? I think we have a lot of experience to say that's probably true. I mean, for example, they would argue, that left to their own devices, human beings would say that slavery is fine, okay, as we did for a very long time. That it takes a long time for human beings to come up with laws that are just. And even then, that because human beings are creatures, that our limitations prevent us from really putting into practice a just law. As a consequence, what Muslims have done from the very, very beginning, and this begins with Muhammad, already, even before the Quran is written down, while it's still an oral tradition, people decided, they recognized that he was the best interpreter. He was the best person who understood the revelation. And so they followed his practice. What did Muhammad do in a particular situation? Okay, so let's say I wanted to sell my herd of sheep to somebody who was an idolater. I might go to Muhammad and say, what should I do? Okay? And he might say, well, in certain circumstances this is all right, in certain circumstances it's not. My daughter wants to marry someone who isn't a monotheist. What should I do? Okay? All of these questions come up. And essentially, the Muslim community begins to write down what Muhammad did, what his practices were, what his sayings were, and how he lived. And this, because it is based on his interpretation of revelation, becomes the foundation for Islamic society. Now, what that meant was that as Islam spread throughout the Middle East, more and more, that Islamic law was put into place. And in general, some of you probably have heard of this idea of the Dar al-Islam, okay? That you have the Dar al-Islam, which means the house of Islam, and outside of this is called the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Okay. Essentially what happens is that we find that within the Dar al-Islam, everything is regulated according to Islamic law, and minorities, or in some cases even majorities of non-Christians, could practice their religion, I keep saying non-Christians, of non-Muslims, could practice their religion as long as they were monotheists within certain parameters. Okay, they were not allowed to expand their religion. They generally could not build new church buildings. They couldn't gain converts. They couldn't be ostentatious in their worship, processions and things like that, but they could continue to practice, okay, with the idea that eventually, through attrition, that they would probably become Muslim. So they were a tolerated majority or eventually a minority. This continues on for 1,400 years. And in many ways, it's very successful. It creates an extremely stable society. When we get to the modern period, this idea comes, this way of thinking about society and how society ought to be structured, and particularly in the modern world, religious freedom becomes a very important issue. And how do we come to a common notion of what is just? Okay. So law and religion, two very, very tricky and complicated topics. Islam comes into conflict with a Christian Enlightenment worldview that tends to put a great deal of emphasis on the value of human reason, on the individual conscience, on religious freedom, on our own ability to collectively come up with a society that is somewhat just. Okay. That if we vote and we are informed, that we will come up with laws that are just, that we will go down the right path. Right. By the time we get to, let's say, the 60s, okay, and there's a lot that happens in between this time, there's a lot of turmoil in many countries that were predominantly Muslim, as people came more and more and more into conflict with movements of secularization. And we have to remember that in many countries in the Middle East, there were secularizing and in many cases anti-religious dictators that had been supported by Western powers, some that were not. But what we find is that Islam as a religion is being repressed in many places. And a lot of Muslims saw this as a Christian, or at least coming out of a Christian society, European society. First Europe and then eventually America. On 9/11, what we see erupting is a kind of a full-blown attack that is intended to, that is directed at Western financial institutions, military institutions, governmental institutions. Okay? The Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and probably the White House. Okay? With the intention of bringing to an end, okay, both symbolically but also practically, this repression of an Islamic ideal. From a Muslim perspective, and this is one of the things that we've spent a lot of time talking about in dialogue in the last 10 years, there is an assumption in Europe and in North America that everyone will agree with a separation of church and state, democracy as the best means of government, reason and natural law as the, or however we construe that, as the best source of law. And this is something that the Muslim community has, for the last 13 centuries, completely disagreed with. All right. So one of the things that I think we need to think about as we reflect on what has happened in the, in some of the developments in the last 10 years that I'll mention in a couple of minutes, is that we're becoming more and more aware that although there are a lot of commonalities between Muslims and Christians, and I'll say something in a moment about the Common Word document that draws attention to that, on the other hand, there is a very deep division with regard to how Christians and Muslims, and I would say even Jews and Christians and Muslims, regard human person, the foundation of society. What is the best way to create a society in which human beings can flourish? Christians have tended to focus historically on the idea of the individual vocation. This is not to downplay the importance of the community of the, particularly the body of Christ in the church. But one of the things that really changed society with the coming of Christianity was the idea of the individual vocation. If you think about the New Testament, one of the things that you see that in the New Testament that is absolutely astounding in the first century is that young women have a vocation that is not marriage. It is not tied to their marriage to a man. The notion that you can have a monastic life, that one can have individual spiritual experience, that one is not participating in the liturgy, for example, simply as a sacrifice for somebody else, generally for the community or for one's family, but that there's an individual vocation. Right? As a consequence, particularly Western thought in Christianity has developed with a very strong emphasis on the individual. Yeah. And we have to generally push people in the direction of thinking about the common good. In Islam, it's exactly the opposite. In Islam, the emphasis is entirely on the community, with very little focus on the individual. Now, these two things are not necessarily incompatible. But one of the things that we're finding is that this comes up in dialogue all of the time, that the assumptions that lie at the foundation of democratic worldview, and especially religious freedom, the notion that I myself would think about and explore my religion, that I have a personal relationship to God, an individual relationship, and that I can change my religion based on my convictions, and that I might stand up against the community or against the state out of religious convictions. Okay. This is a very Christian idea. We find, for example, in Christianity, pacifism. Okay. In Islam, pacifism does not exist because there's no real reason for it. If one lives according to the law and one lives in a society that is structured according to just laws, then one has no reason to protest against the state. The only time one would do that would be, for instance, if you had a non-Muslim ruler. Now, we can think of all kinds of exceptions to this, but in general, I think one of the problems that we're running into, and this is something that is very, very difficult, is that the common movement worldwide has been towards secularization, towards separation of religion and state, towards a compartmentalization and an individualization of religious beliefs. I'll just say one more thing about that before I move on to something else here. That as we begin to think about this, there's been a real problem in talking about how a community, okay, can come together and vote, okay, and choose leaders, okay, to represent them. Islam does not have a history of representation. Okay, this is another difficulty that we've run into. There is, for example, in Islam, no hierarchical structure. Okay? In general, one lives according to the law. A legal scholar is somebody who knows the law and who can apply the law, but who is not intended in any way to make law. Okay? In no way to make law, but simply to apply certain principles that have existed from the beginning. Now, once again, we can argue whether that's true or not, okay? But in general, the idea is that one does not make law. There are no real representatives of the community. And so how can, or for what purpose really, does one elect a representative leader? We find one of the problems in engaging in conversations with Muslims from the Catholic perspective is that in the Catholic Church, obviously, there's a very clear hierarchy, okay? And you always know, if you've got a priest or a monsignor or a bishop or a cardinal, you kind of know how high up you've gone, okay? And where you stand. With Muslims in general, even the highest level clerics, somebody who teaches at Al-Azhar in Egypt, who might be considered a real authority in religious law, would not presume to represent the Muslim community. Okay? And therefore, a lot of times when agreements or disagreements are reached, this does not have much of an effect within the community. Okay? It's very difficult then to come up with some kind of an agreement. For instance, in this case, we can talk about 9/11, that after 9/11, a lot of people were quite disturbed by the fact that the Muslim community didn't come out with an official statement. Okay? Everyone kept waiting around, and here and there somebody from various mosques would come forward and make a statement, but in general there was no official statement. The reason for that is actually kind of obvious, which is that there is no one that has the authority in the Muslim community to make that kind of a statement. All right. So that brings us then to one of the things that has happened in the last 10 years. And I'll just say I want to talk about two different things that have happened. One is that you may remember that almost immediately after Pope Benedict was elected, in September, he gave an address, which has come to be called the Regensburg Address, in which he gave a lecture at his home university where he had been a professor. And in the course of this lecture, which focused on the relationship really between faith and reason, it was a lecture that was essentially directed towards the faculty of this university, trying to remind European professors that they needed to take seriously the relationship between faith and reason, and that without both of them, that faith could go off and reason would go off, and that these two things would both lose their way. Now, he used an unfortunate example. The example that he used was from the Middle Ages, 14th century, in which at one point the Emperor of Constantinople, who had just, his city had been under siege by the Muslims, and he's come